Hi there. Welcome to Straight Talk for Mental Health. I'm here with my associate Janice D'Souza. So, welcome, Janice.
Hi, Karen. Thanks. How are you doing today?
I'm good. We're still dealing with all these coughs and colds going around. So, I'm probably going to be a bit scratchy and a little coffee. But yeah, there's so much of it going around this year. Just seems to hit after Christmas. What I wanted to talk about today is I know it's a bit dipping back into 2022, but I think we posted this about how the word of the year in 2022 was gaslighting. And so that got talked about more as the year progressed to where it became the word of the year. And I also wanted to kind of connect about love bombing because I don't know what you're seeing, but I see oftentimes there is that roller coaster that seems to be more predominant if you're having a relationship with somebody who's got narcissism tendencies
Mm.
or even a narcissistic personality disorder. There's a lot of different elements in those relationships, but what I really want to talk with you today about are those two pieces. Because I do think, although they can happen separately and on their own, I sometimes see one leading to the other. So it's kind of like this roller coaster where there's all of this like love bombing and kind of like where the narcissist makes the other person like feel like they are everything to that person, and it's almost like part of the setup because then as soon as something goes wrong in the relationship and the narcissist is so easily injured, and they can't look at what their contribution is to the issues, it all becomes about the other person. So in some ways the narcissist makes the other person everything that's great and everything that's bad, right? And so what do you think about those concepts as I'm kind of throwing those out?
Yeah, and just like from what you've shared, like straight away, this one word comes to my mind, and it's like an illusion. So
Mm,
it's like the start of the entire relationship, and then whether this continues for a year or even longer. Some people stay in these relationships for much longer, but it's because of that initial illusion that was created of this person being that perfect person, showering them with love, whether that's in terms of like compliments, gifts, apologies. Um, and you're right, the word gaslighting was used a lot. And I would even hear from some of my friends, like, who are online dating and using these dating apps. Like, it's a very common word, and we see it everywhere on social media now, too. And it's this constant, like you said, where it's either the all the bad or all the good, and this one person is kind of in control. That's really like that underlying nature of that dominant, whether it's the narcissist in the relationship. It's that underlying feeling of wanting to control the other person, and it comes in forms of manipulation or other types of abuse, as you were mentioning. So that's kind of like the thoughts I've had on it, and just based off, like, what I've heard from other people too. And then you're kind of stuck in this cycle where before you know it, you've been in it for so long that it gets harder and harder to leave.
yeah, wow, you're saying so much here. I'm writing
Yeah.
down that you're saying because I'm like, there's so many important words you're using. So let's take this apart because I think our listeners might be interested, and they may feel validated or understood if they're
Yeah.
in these kinds of relationships because it does get a bit crazy making where we don't really know which way is up. And I really want to take apart what you're saying because I think a lot of what you said makes sense. So the controlling the narrative, I think this is a big part of it. I like that you said that word because whether somebody has narcissistic tendencies or a narcissistic personality disorder, or they have what we call when in the work that we do, a distorted relationship with control. Because if I can't be vulnerable, if I feel insecure about myself, if I lack awareness about that, then one of the biggest ways that can show up is over controlling the narratives in our life, which can include our relationships, right? So some people
Absolutely.
aware of that and some people not, but it does seem a lot to do with deeper insecurities where we can't be vulnerable. And so it's almost like if I can't, like the opposites or like because if I can be vulnerable, then I don't have to control as much. I can just
Uh,
be I can just be free, right? But if I can't be vulnerable, then I almost like buddy up with control, because then things are more certain and clear, and then there's less like wiggle room.
Yeah, and I love the way you said that, like, being vulnerable is to kind of be free. So, like, being in tune with your emotions, being really, like, truly being able to display your emotions, not just that, like, idea of it, or like you said, that buddying up with control. So I really like what you're saying about that.
Yeah, I saw an excerpt from Brene Brown. I want to watch it again, but yeah, she reminded us about like what vulnerability was, and I have to look it up because she said something about, when we talk about exposing ourselves to vulnerability, it isn't about I posted 5 pictures of me in a
Yeah.
bikini in Mexico, because it's
Yeah.
like people are almost getting fooled into thinking that I post all these things on my social media, and so I'm
Yep.
exposing myself, and so I'm vulnerable. And what she's really talking about is like these deeper emotions. So yeah, she's obviously done groundbreaking work on this whole idea of shame and vulnerability. But so let's get back. Yeah, the love bombing and the gaslighting are kind of two ways or two behaviors to control the narrative.
Hmm.
Because if I am running the narrative, whether you're all good or all bad, I'm in charge of that, and I'm taking the lead to convince you of those things. And somehow that's my unconscious like deal that I've made with myself, um that as long as I'm the one setting the narrative, then I don't have to be seen as much. There is more certainty and less kind of like spontaneity. So then I'm in charge, and that feels right. And then I don't have to be vulnerable. So yeah, I love that you pointed that out about control. I also love this word illusion, because that's not a word that I often hear. Tell me what you're thinking about with that.
Yeah, so when I say illusion, I'm thinking like right from the start of a relationship, for example, where the person that is in control really displays all this like endless affection, showers them with gifts, compliments, kind of portrays themselves as this like perfect partner who like never gets upset, and like, who's very understanding of like the other person's needs and wants. And in those moments, it's like for the other person, it's this image that's created of this perfect relationship, this perfect partner. But when this illusion breaks is when something happens to that person who, is displaying the control. Something happens that upsets that person. And then suddenly that entire illusion breaks because you start to see that other person's true side. Whether it's in terms of their insecurities, you see all of it coming out, but not in the way that you ever expected that person to handle this situation. And that's when like all these hurtful things come out, name calling, the manipulation begins. So all of these things that eventually come out with this one thing that's upset that person, that's when that idea or that perfect illusion breaks. So those were like kind of my thoughts on it, but I don't know, do you have anything like
Yeah,
you
you know what it gets me thinking is that it's like a double illusion. Because when you said the word illusion at first, I was thinking of it from the narcissist side, of how they're painting an illusion of that person for themselves, for the partner, to say how perfect you are or how rotten you are. But you're
yeah.
right, because I think it's a double illusion, because then the illusion for the partner who's receiving that, they then get an illusion of that partner,
Yeah.
because the love bombing is almost like it starts going in both directions.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I actually didn't look at it from that. That's actually pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
it's kind of interesting how I was thinking of it from one
Yeah.
partner and you were thinking it for the other. Yeah. And then it started making me think, yeah, like there's almost like a double illusion happening. So what I also start to think about is like why people take the love bombing, right? Like how do they buy the illusion? Because you've almost like you drink the Kool-Aid, right? You drink this love bombing Kool-Aid, and it pumps you up because you're hearing all these amazing things about yourself. And then it's kind of like part of where the control sets in. And I know in the work that I've done, I mean, who doesn't like to hear good things about themselves? So like it happens, I think, anyway. But I think where the love bombing takes it that extra step where you kind of cross the line from compliments and noticing the good things and being grateful and kind of like shining back or reflecting back to your partner like all the good things you're seeing about them and what attracted you to them. But then the love bombing, it's like it crosses a line into that
Mhm.
illusion world where it's like
Yes.
I'm making you feel like you're perfect.
Yeah, for sure.
I start to think about what puts people at risk for that because at some level we want to hear the compliments, but we also want to be in a place where it's where when that line gets crossed into that illusionary world where we start to have those like oh feelings like wait a
mm,
second, like I know I'm great, but am I really everything my partner's painting me to be? That's
yeah, no, for sure.
I
Yeah.
start to think about what puts people at risk for that. And I think the number one word that comes to mind for me is self-worth. Because if
Mhm.
I'm empty, if I'm feeling so bad about myself, I'm walking around with this kind of like this emptiness, and I'm just like waiting for it to be filled up, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, self-worth was definitely something that came to my mind as well, along with those deeper self-insecurities that we already have, whether that's bringing it in from past relationships or past trauma or just things that we've already experienced that have already affected that self-worth. Um, I think that's definitely a good point. And I'm gonna like, I'll be vulnerable here for a second as well and just speak on my own experience. Many years ago, I got out of a bad relationship and then I kind of entered the dating game and I literally, when people would do the gaslighting and the love bombing, I would actually accept it because you just want to feel good again after going through something that wasn't the greatest. And you just kind of feed into it and you're just like, it's all rainbows and sunshines until it's not. But by then you're like, wow, I felt so great after such a long time. So you kind of, feed into that energy over and over.
Yeah, I think you make a good point because whether our emptiness or our self worth is too negative or the emptiness is too big from childhood experiences, like I see that where if our self worth took a hit, then it could be some things right from childhood where we were bullied or shamed or abused or went through major losses, or it could be something that is more recent, right? Like I definitely had my own experiences of being love bombed after my divorce, right?
Mhm,
So for you maybe an upsetting relationship, for me it was a divorce, and it upsets the balance because
mhm.
instead of being able to validate ourselves, it's like we took that negative experience, and we're looking for validation outside rather than being able to validate ourselves. Yeah, that
Absolutely. You
that
said it
is
perfectly.
yeah,
Yeah.
that is so important because, like, if we don't work through what happened, either in childhood or in recent experiences, the whole internal dialogue changes. And if we lose that ability to validate ourselves, and we are just almost like sitting ducks waiting for somebody to fill us up.
Yeah.
And along comes the narcissist in a lot of these situations. And it's almost like they can spot us a mile away, right? Oh my gosh.
That's what I was gonna
Right?
say. It's almost like they feed into our needs, our insecurities, like they learn it and feed from it, and then that's how we get stuck in this cycle.
Because I think if the other person's like agenda, as conscious of it as they are or not, if it's control,
Mhm.
right? Then I'm more likely to control somebody who is kind of like wounded,
Yes,
and
yes.
on the battlefield, and they're waiting for me to validate them. They need it too much. So I'm going to have a much better chance of love bombing you if you're, obviously in a hurting place and
Yes.
waiting to be filled up from the outside. Oh, yeah.
No, that's really interesting. It's like love bombing works so well for that other person because 'cause they're waiting to be filled with all that love. Like,
Yeah.
that's what's
So
missing,
it's like
yeah.
a surefire, like however conscious they are of it, who they pick to love bomb, right?
Yeah,
There's no coincidence in terms of who's at higher risk and who's kind of waiting to be love bombed.
yeah, yeah.
And then as it plays out, because I wrote down here the 2 to 3 year trigger. So it's like somewhere between what Harville Hendricks talks about in his imago theory for couples is this we're all on that best behavior, and then kind of at that, he kind of talked about it being between the 1.5 year to 3 year, though sometimes it's sooner. I don't often see it later. If anything, in the work that I do, I see it happening before the year and a half. Is like, how long can we hang on to our best behavior,
Yeah.
and then the triggers start happening. And if anybody is narcissistic, that timeline will definitely be moved up, because what you were saying a few minutes ago, because there's inevitably something that we do wrong or that we disagree on. And then it's like, how are we going to deal with that? And that's where I guess part of what we're talking about today, because it doesn't always lead to gaslighting, but it can, and then it
Yes.
gets really ugly at that point. Yeah, it's so tough. So what do you think about that idea about Harville Hendrix kind of identifying this idea of it's not necessarily the false advertising, but we are kind of wanting to bring our best version of ourselves. So it kind of is that honeymoon phase of the relationship. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Like the honeymoon phase, I hear talked about so much, and it's such an important phase. And I think once again, it just goes back to that perfectness in the first 6 months to a year. Um, yeah, no, it's an interesting concept because you're just so in love during that time. You just want, like I said, you want to
Yeah,
see the
you're like,
rainbows, the sunshines. Yeah, you're so hopeful that this is it. It's so good. And then the minute that like kind of snaps, it's like, oh wow, like where did all of this come from? And a lot of times I think it's just hard to get out of that because you want to keep going back and think about, oh, but this person was so nice. Oh, but the past 6 months to a year were so great. Maybe they're having a one-off moment. Maybe everything they said to me, they didn't mean it. They were just having a bad day. But
yeah,
then that's exactly what happens. And then something else I've noticed is like, even if the person does realize that this is not for me and then they want to leave, the person, like the narcissist, for example, kind of comes back and love bombs. And that's where the sorries come in, the I love yous, the oh my God, it won't happen again. It's not me. I was just, a lot was going on. And then that's how, if that person already is questioning their self-worth and the insecurities you kind of given once again. Um,
oh, that's such a good point, right? It reminds me of the old literature on abused wife syndrome, where there was that anger cycle of like everything's great, something goes wrong, the person kind of has an outburst, and then they try to make it all better and apologize, and everything's rosy again. And the emotional like torment that comes from running through that cycle. So I'm kind of picturing it as love bombing, gaslighting, back to love bombing,
yeah.
and the wearing down of that. I think we can have all kinds of explanations to ourselves about the gaslighting. And there was I haven't seen the movie, but when I look this up, because I'm like, where does this term come from? It was like a 1944. On some sites I saw it was a movie. Some places I think they made the movie to a play. I don't know what came first, the movie or the play. But yeah, apparently it was this male female relationship where the male was basically making the female character crazy and then blaming her for being crazy,
Mm.
right? And I guess the name of that film was Gaslighting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's where the term comes from. But yeah, this idea of it goes back and forth, because if we're being gaslit and we believe, like we believe the love bomb, we now also now believe the gaslighting, that we are the problem. And if we came into the relationship with insecurities,
Mhm.
that puts us at risk for believing both the good and the bad, that I want to believe all these wonderful things about me, and at the same time, if there's a problem, then I am more susceptible to believing that narrative, that there was something wrong with me. And also kind of what you were saying is like you try to justify it, right? Oh, it's just a one, like just one off, or because we can't let go of our idea of how amazing this relationship could be for us.
Yeah, definitely. And something else I just thought along the lines of that, and I've heard from friends who are dating and like who've brought up gaslighting and love bombing is it's this, and I've seen it in movies so much too. It's almost like this notion like that person who's looking for the love, um, who's a passive person in the relationship almost wants to fix the other person. So
Oh,
that's also where that constant belief comes from. Like, I can fix this person. My love will change them. They've been through so much. Like, they're apologizing now. They deserve a second chance, a third chance, a fourth chance. And it's that inner hope that I've noticed, even when I speak with friends on this, is that they truly believe that they can fix what's going on for the other person and change that narcissist personality. And like, I don't know, have you like come across this? What are your
oh yeah.
thoughts on
Oh
this?
yeah. Yeah. Being the fixer, right? I see this come up in the work that I do. Especially, it kind of goes beyond what you and I are talking about in terms of insecurities and self-worth. And it goes into a lot of times what I see is if I was a fixer in my family and somehow trying, like, especially if I'm like the oldest daughter, I see that
Yeah.
being the highest kind of like rate of this happening or occurring, just from birth order and gender. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen with the other children or with
Mhm.
the boys in the family, but I see it happening most predominantly if you're the oldest daughter. You become the fixer to other problems, whether it's the sibling problems or the parents' problems, where there's that role reversal, where whatever was going on for the parents, they're like over depending on that child to help in whether it's a single parent or a marriage or marital issues or addiction or mental health, all kinds of things that kind of uh, promote that one child to being the fixer. And
Mm,
this is where I see it in the work that I do, that those people tend to have a higher risk of becoming fixers in their relationships, in their romantic relationships as adults. And I think it kind of goes alongside with what we're talking about, because whether it's about self-worth and I can't like allow myself to see the reality of the negative of the relationship, or it's like, hey, when I was younger, I got attention or I felt valuable if I could fix people in my family. Why don't I do that again and apply it here? Because sometimes oftentimes there's like an inherent payoff that children will get to be the fixers in their
mhm.
family when all hell's breaking loose, and then I can be of help, and then all of a sudden things start shifting. So I think we
Yeah,
could easily adopt that fixer rule, but I think what it does is prolong the gaslighting, right? Because inevitably the only person who can fix how that gaslighter is working is that person.
person. Yep, absolutely.
Maybe it's part of the manipulation, right? Like if I make you believe that you can stay with me because you need to
Yeah,
fix me, that might be part of the overall manipulation.
yeah, for sure. No, very interesting points for sure.
Yeah, I had a conversation recently with a friend who did have a past relationship with a gaslighter narcissist. And that's actually the one thing she said to me. She said, Karen, I got caught into a situation where I thought I could fix my partner.
Mm,
And she was so emphatic about this. Oh my gosh, you should, like, she was just like, you need to remember, right, that I could not fix him, and people who are in relationships with people who are gaslighters, they have to accept, right? You just like said it so sorry. You
yeah,
have to accept that you cannot fix the other person.
yeah,
So it's about inevitably accepting the limits of that relationship. So why don't we spend the last couple of minutes here talking about what to do about all of this? Because if any of our theories are making sense to any of our listeners, whether it's about feeling too insecure or unworthy as children, or being the fixer in their families, or having gone through recent grief, like what you and I were talking about a few minutes ago, and then all of a sudden we're riding this roller coaster, because I think the wearing down happens. And I wrote down 7 reminders I wrote on my notepad. The research I read years ago said that as humans, we often need 7 big reminders before we decide to do anything different. So that whole idea of like pushing down and pushing on despite some of the problems. And So I think sometimes for you and I as therapists, as you know, like by the time people come to our door, I was saying this to somebody yesterday, it's not usually like, oh yeah, that bad thing happened last week. It's going to be like, Karen, like this is, I can go back. This has been going on for years, right? And it kind of blows our mind that you're like, oh my gosh, you've been suffering this long. But it just seems to be part of the human condition where the suffering is going so long. So what do we want to do? I think in the work that we do at KG and Associates, it's always about those two layers. Because if we're working with somebody who's either the gaslighter or being gaslit or love bombed, we have to help them look at, in the heat of the moment, what is happening
Hmm.
and how am I going to think and feel and act about this? Otherwise, I become part of that trigger reaction and then I just invite more suffering. And at the same time, going after the root cause, because I don't know what it was like for you, but for me, I had to go back and re-grieve my divorce to actually like forgive
Hmm.
myself
Hmm.
for what I contributed to the marriage not working, but and at the same time, forgive, my ex-husband so that I could ground my grief in a way that actually helped me recover my self-worth. And then I could make a better decision about this negative relationship that I was in at the time. So I just always keep coming back to the fact that there's those two layers. What do you think about the work that you're doing and how you're helping people with this?
Yeah, no, and it was amazing to hear you say that because you're right, like to help them kind of grieve that loss if there was a loss or a previous relationship that didn't work out so well. So definitely doing that. And then I think really working with them to help them recognize what other ways can they fill that cup of theirs, that empty cup. What
Mhm.
other areas in their life, what other supports do they have? What other healthy relationships do they have that they can fill that cup with so they're not so reliant on like that unhealthy relationship with the narcissist to kind of fill that up for them. And I really like to work with clients like alongside with that whole self-care piece once again that we constantly, start with as a good foundation because with that self-care piece, you're slowly building your cup by doing things that you enjoy, things that you're dependent on yourself for that happiness, not someone else. And
Yeah.
definitely, yeah,
I think those are two good points because to me it comes back to like the boundary because
yeah,
if I'm drinking the love bombing or gaslighting Kool-Aid, it means that I've lost my own personal boundary
hmm,
around myself and my relationship, the boundary with the other person is just all kind of blurred.
yes,
And it's kind of like I don't even know where I end and you begin, that type of enmeshment that happens with
hmm,
relationships. So as soon as I take a step back and what you're saying is like, well, what else do I have going for myself in my life, or what else do I need to kind of nourish in a bigger way that fills me up outside of this
yeah,
relationship? And kind of that self-care mechanism of like what am I doing every day to feel good about myself. So I think part of it is how am I going to manage the triggers with the other person, so how am I going to like show up to resolve conflicts in a healthier way, and deeper down, whether it's grief that we have to ground or trauma that we have to work through, whatever is kind of like putting us at higher risk to begin with.
hmm,
What you're talking about is what are the other sources that will make me feel good, so that the relationship isn't the only go to, and the self care. I want to talk about this probably in another podcast, but I don't know if you've seen the Jonah Hill movie on Netflix, Stutz. Stutz is the last name of his therapist. He did like a 90-minute documentary with him and his therapist. Have you seen it?
no, not yet, but I'm gonna watch it. I'll watch it this weekend, actually.
Yeah, it's like I wouldn't say it's like in the top 10 most fabulous movies of
Mhm.
all time, but there was some really interesting pieces. So Stutz is the last name of his therapist in New York City.
Okay.
And the therapist actually has Parkinson's, so it added a whole other element to the film about Parkinson's. But he was actually interviewing his therapist about the therapist's life, and they had some actually interesting common experiences. So I won't spoil it for you, but But then I saw a stat that came out about the movie, and although the therapist was talking about self-care, what I read on the media about the movie was about the fact that the therapist, I guess he must have said this in the film and I just missed it, but 85% of our mental health comes from our lifestyle.
Mhm.
And so, take a look at the movie. I'll be interested to hear what you think about it. But it confirmed for me the work that we do with clients around eating, sleeping, exercise, and leisure because of how important that is to our daily mindset. And obviously, the better we're taking care of ourselves, the better relationship we have with ourselves, we're able to have better relationships with other people. So thanks for bringing that part up because that's a whole other part of the work that we do. And yeah, the film just kind of confirmed the other thing, and we'll talk about it in other podcasts, is the therapist really believes in tools.
Yes.
And that's how the movie starts. And the therapist actually uses index cards of all the tools that he uses, and he talked about some of them in the movie. But Jonah made the point right from the very beginning about the fact that what he got out of the work he was
Mhm.
doing was that it wasn't just like having conversations; it was actually having specific ideas of what to do differently. So I was like, "Oh, wait a second, that's what we do. That's okay. We're definitely on the right track
Yeah.
with this." So it was just a good confirmation. So great. Well, I hope this conversation resonated with our listeners about this roller coaster. I think, it's going to continue, even though it kind of got highlighted last year. I think it'll continue to be part of the narrative in 2023. And I think there's a lot that we can begin to look at as we combine these two elements in the work that we do and in our own lives. So, thanks for coming in and have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Karen. You too.